Paul Smith, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Oh, very good. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited, Paul. You have three best-selling books, including a couple we're going to spend a little time talking about today. Lead with a Story and the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. But before we get to that, would love to know whereabouts you grew up and how your upbringing impacted who you've become.
Yeah, so I live in the Cincinnati, Ohio area now, but I was born and raised in the state of Arkansas, and I may be the first person you've ever met from that state. It's often the case with people, and I'm quite sure that had something to do with me becoming who I am. You might detect every once in a while a little Southern drawl in my voice, especially if I'm talking to my dad. Um, well, it probably also affected my I don't know, outgoingness or friendliness. The Southern people tend to pride themselves on being friendly and outgoing, and so I hope some of that rubbed off on me.
Yeah, I'm sure you still have some of that with you. And also I'm in Washington, DC, Paul. So every president that comes to DC from whatever part of the country, whether it's Chicago or Arkansas, they bring a cohort of people with them that end
Mm.
up staying in DC region.
Oh,
So
of
lots
course.
of people from Bill
So from the
Clinton's
Clinton
time.
administration, you probably have met them. Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, stayed in the DC area. So, growing up in Arkansas, you ended up getting your Wharton MBA and working at P&G. What was your role at P&G like?
Yeah, so I was there for 20 years. So I had a number of roles. I actually started in finance and accounting roles. So I was a finance manager of a number of different, departments, and I had manufacturing plants in California and sales offices in Seattle. But then after about half of that time there, I switched into consumer research, so market insights, and I finished my career out there. In my last job, I was in charge of the consumer research department for about a $6 billion global business unit, P&G's paper businesses. So Bounty paper towels and Charmin bath tissue and Puffs facial tissue. You probably recognize those names. So I was in charge of consumer research for that global business for P&G.
So, what was it that got you so interested in storytelling, Paul?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit of just a personal frustration. So it started because I recognized that the leaders I admired the most inside the company, the people that I wanted to work for, that I wanted to kind of grow up and be like in the company, were really good at it. And that frustrated me because I didn't think I was, and B, nobody ever taught me how to do that. So here I went off and spent a lot of money getting this Ivy League MBA. Nobody taught me that there. They didn't teach me that at P&G when I got there. I spent a couple of years at Accenture as a consultant. They didn't teach me that there. Certainly didn't learn it in undergrad. So that was frustrating because it was clearly important. And so I just kind of sat out on my own little personal learning journey, and I started reading all the books I could find on the topic. Still didn't know how to do it. And then I started interviewing leaders who I thought were good at it, first inside the company and then outside the company. And somewhere along that journey, it stopped being my own little selfish learning journey and became an idea for a book. I thought, gosh, if I want to know this that badly, maybe there are other people who do as well. And so it became an idea for a book, and that's what became Lead with a Story, which was the first book.
And it's incredible, Paul, because on Tuesdays I have conversations with magnificent change makers from the greater Washington, D.C., DMV region. Many of the top business leaders, in some instances, nonprofit and government leaders that have done significant things to impact the community, the region, their organizations. But a lot of them are not that great at telling their stories. Why is it that as leaders, I mean, we've heard as people, we've been storytelling animals, stories make up our world. Yuval Harari talks about that. Why is it that we are so bad in many instances at telling our own stories?
Yeah, well, and especially leaders. And I'll tell you my observation interviewing leaders, and I've interviewed probably 300 or so CEOs, executives, leaders at hundreds of companies in 25 countries around the world now as part of the research for these books. So maybe even more leaders than you've interviewed. I don't know. Maybe we're about in the same area there. And I'll tell you my observation and see if it fits with yours. In many cases, the more senior the leader, the worse they are at storytelling because they default to wanting to give people advice and tell them what to do. Because that's their job. You know, once you're the CEO of the company, that's all you do is tell people what to do. And so when I would sit down to interview these leaders for the book, I had to be very careful in the way I asked the questions, because if I wasn't, they would go back into default give advice mode, you know, and almost all their advice sounded the same after a while. It was, well, you know, Paul, if you want to be successful in my business, there's three things you got to do. You got to develop a great high quality product. You got to develop a fabulous marketing message to go with it. And you got to surround yourself with great people and a great team to get it done. And after about, 15 or 20 CEOs told me that, I thought, I think, my 10-year-old kid could have figured that out. I mean, well, of course you want a great product and great marketing and great people. Like, that's just not newsworthy, but yet that's what they've come up with. Now, the real genius behind all of their successes is that they figured out exactly how to create that great product and the great marketing message and finding the great people. But they tend to want to summarize their work, their years and decades of advice into a few pithy little comments. And it comes out as something that is so commonsensical that it's just boringly uninteresting. And instead, so as soon as they started getting into advice giving mode, I would literally interrupt and go, wait. Let me ask the question a different way, even though I didn't ask them for advice the first time, but I was sure not going to ask the second time. And I would start a question with these words. Tell me about a time when, and I would finish that with something, because there's only one way to answer that question is for them to tell me a story. Tell me about a time when you made a huge mistake. You can't answer that question by going, well, Paul, the 3 ways to be successful in my business, you just can't. You have to tell me about that time where you really screwed up. Or or tell me about, one of your biggest successes, or tell me about the biggest surprise you ever had at work. Oh, that would have been the time when, blah, blah, and then the stories come out. So if you want stories, you don't ask for stories, by the way, because you'll get something different when you ask for stories. You have to ask them about a time when something happened, something in particular happened, and that will get them to tell you a story. But if you don't do that, they default to giving you advice, and most of that's boring.
And that's a powerful question that you mentioned, Paul. Tell me about a time when I spent many years of my life, almost 25 years, with Dale Carnegie Training, initially starting out in a training role, then sales, then running operations in DC, and then internationally. And one of the things we had to consistently, even in the Dale Carnegie course, work with people on is to think about an incident, a moment in time. And a lot of times people have a tough time talking about those moments in time. And as you mentioned, the higher up they go in organizations, the more general the view becomes, and they communicate in generalities rather than specifics and stories. So before we go deeper into the story, what is your definition of a story? Is it just a moment in time, or what makes for a good story?
Yeah. So, well, those are two different questions. So what is a story is one question. What makes for a good story or a great story is a very different question. Okay. So let me answer both of them. So what a story is, a moment in time is not a bad definition. I would take that. I generally say it's a narrative about something that happened to someone. Okay. So notice there's a someone in there. It's about a human being, not about some company or some general organization. And it's about something that happened to that person. So that's my general definition. That when I get more specific in a training course, I go, well, there are 6 elements that make up that definition. There's a time, a place, a main character. That main character has got a goal of some kind. There's probably someone or something getting in the way of that goal, a villain, if you will. And there are events that transpire along the way that hopefully resolve themselves in the end. Now, so that's those are definitions of a story, or those are the attributes that I think define a story from a speech or a piece of advice or an email or a presentation or some other form of communication. But those things don't make it a great story. right? That's just, if you play cards at all or poker, I think you mentioned poker before we hit the record button here. Um, that's jacks to open, right? Those six things, if you don't have those six things, you don't even have a story. So it can't be a good story or a bad story because it's not even a story yet, right? You have to have those six things for it to even be a story. Now, to make it a great story, you need to add some things to those six things, like a hero that your audience can relate to, and a worthy challenge, um, some emotional engagement, an exciting structure to the story. I mean, so there are other elements. A surprise ending would be great. Those things take something that is a story and makes them a great story. But you got to start with those six things, or the thing that you're talking about isn't even a story.
And that's part of the challenge that I had, Paul, in guiding some of my guests for the interviews and some of the leaders I have interactions with. I had read Joseph Campbell's work back in business school. One of my professors, Robert Beese, really loved Joseph Campbell. And over the years, I understood the hero's journey a lot better and the role it plays in storytelling and in movie making of all kinds. But that's a very complex way of trying to help people understand the arc of a story, which is, in many instances, I found the people that I interacted with and the leaders being overwhelmed trying to think about a Joseph Campbell type hero's journey rather than a pretty simple storytelling process.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I feel the same way. And I can't tell you how many people I run into that when I get to the part of the training course where I'm talking about structure, they go, oh, are we going to use Joseph Campbell's hero's journey? And no, I mean, as you know, that's like a 17-step, very complicated call and return and all these, if you're going to write your first screenplay, uh, knock yourself out with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. If you're going to, write your first novel, knock yourself out with that. But if you're going to try and tell a 2-minute story at work, there is no way you're going to get through all 17 steps. So yeah, I recommend something much short. And by the way, 2 or 3 minutes is what these business stories should be. So yeah, so to me, it's really 4 steps: context, challenge, conflict, resolution. And if you really wanted to get it down even shorter, conflict resolution. I mean, that's the heart of a story: conflict and resolution. Now, sometimes that's not informative enough for somebody to sit down and craft out a story. So I've got these 8 questions that I typically teach people. If you answer these 8 questions in this order, a story will emerge in the right format. It won't be as complex as the hero's journey, but it'll be good enough for a 2 or 3 minute business story. And we can talk about those if you're interested.
Yeah, and I think in order to be able to do that, Paul, it requires for us to also have a certain level of self-reflection. In that these are not stories, even though they're a couple of minutes long, that they can just come to us at any moment in time. And I find the storytelling, we need to give it some thought. We need to reflect on the stories that can resonate with other people. So, how do you find in your interactions with leaders and as you coach them through the training and your conversations, how do you guide them to try to dig through their past, think about their stories, so they have those 2 3 minute stories to be able to tell using the formula you just mentioned?
Yeah. Great question, because you don't start storytelling by figuring out the structure of a story. You start by figuring out what is your communication objective. So I'm a leader in an organization. I've got some problem that I'm trying to solve for my team. You know, and here's the solution, and I want to communicate it with a story or something. Or I want my team to be more creative and innovative. Or I need to set a vision for the organization. Or I need to lead change. Or whatever your leadership challenge is. Now, as you know from Lead with a Story, there's like 21 different leadership challenges in there. So you start there. What is my communication objective, and who's my audience? And once you know what those 2 things are, then you go look for a story that will help communicate that communication objective. And that could be something from your past. It could be something from somebody else's past, or something you saw happen, even though it didn't happen to you. It could be a story you heard somebody else tell. It doesn't matter. In fact, most of the stories you tell shouldn't be about you. Otherwise you're going to come across as pretty arrogant, right? If all the stories you tell are about you. So you start with the objective, start with the end in mind. Then you go look for a story in your past or somebody else's past that will communicate that. And then you start working on the story, putting it together, use the right structure, use the right emotional engagement techniques, all that kind of stuff. But first, you got to figure out the objective and find a story. And I guess let me ask you a more specific question. You asked, how do you find it? So there are three most productive places to look to find a story. Once you know what your objective is, what you want people to think, feel, or do. That's the way I describe it. You want people to think, feel, or do something different. Now go look for a success, failure, or a moment of clarity around that thing that you want your audience to think, feel, or do, and you're likely to find a good story there. So a success is a time you've seen somebody do that thing really, really well. That's a success. A time you've seen somebody do that thing, but really, really poorly and suffer the consequences. That's a failure. And then the moment of clarity is just the moment that you realize that that's a really important thing to think, feel, or do yourself. Well, tell people what happened to you, and then they'll realize it as well. So success, failure, or moment of clarity around the thing you want people to do is the best three places to go look to find a good story.
And that is such a powerful lesson, Paul. I urge all the listeners to sit down and reflect on that. Those three are a great way for us to understand and come up with the stories that help us make the point that we want to make. So I love the way you structure it and make it accessible. Again, back to Joseph Campbell, whose work is brilliant, and I've referenced it many times with organizational branding and other areas. It is inaccessible to most people to understand, how can I now use this, as you said, to tell a 2-3 minute story, which is what leaders have to do to get their people to act, to believe in something, to make a change, all of those things. The process you outlined is accessible in that leaders can see themselves, can visualize themselves being able to do this. Another part of the point that you make, Paul, is storytelling is about 10-15% of the time. It's not as if as leaders we're walking around needing to be telling stories all the time.
Right. Yeah. Wouldn't that just be, that'd be weird, right? Just walking around telling stories all day. It might be fun, but yeah. So, I'll admit that the 10 to 15%, I don't have a lot of science behind that, although, that's just been my observation after 30 years of being in the working world and 10 years of it dedicated to storytelling is, you go to a meeting, say it's a 1 hour meeting. A good leader will tell 2 or 3 stories during that 1 hour, not 10 stories, not 0, certainly, and probably more than one. So maybe 2 or 3 stories. Each of these stories are 2 or 3 minutes long. So you do the math. That's 6 to 9 minutes out of an hour that a good leader might be telling a story. Well, that's 10 to 15% of the 60 minutes. So that's kind of where I came up with it. I mean, could you be a really effective storyteller on only 7%? Yeah, sure. 20%? Yeah. 50%? Yeesh, that's getting really high, So I think it's somewhere south of 50 in the, 10, 15, 20%.
And the reason I mentioned that number, and I appreciate you saying it's not a scientific percentage point, the reason I mention it is the frustration for leaders on either extreme, in that on one end, they feel like they have to constantly be telling stories. And that's not the case, because that's not the reality leaders lead. And then on the other end, for many leaders who lack the ability to tell stories, they don't tell any stories. So part of what you're saying is you need to incorporate some stories, call it 10%, call it 15%, in order to add power to the points that you're making. And you also reference, Paul, a study that I ended up reading. It's absolutely fascinating. done by Rob Walker and Joshua Glenn with the objects they bought on eBay.
Yeah. Did you want me to share that?
Yeah, would love to. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember what maybe you do or what they do for a living, but this study was they went out and bought 100 items from garage sales and flea markets and stuff, just cheap stuff, ashtray, a nutcracker, a piggy bank. And then they sold all, and by the way, the average price they spent was $1.29. So they spent $129 on 100 items. Then they sold all of them on eBay. And you know how eBay works. You've got a picture of the item and a description, and then people bid on it. Well, they did that and they had the picture, but instead of the description, they just wrote these stories, these just interesting stories, and it was clear in the story that it was a fictional story. So they weren't like claiming that these items were any more special than they were, because they weren't special. They were very unspecial items. But then they just put a silly little story with it. And they ended up selling these items for, I think it was something like a 3,000%, markup, whatever that math turned out to be. It's just a, ridiculous return on their investment. And I think the obvious reason is, well, because they had interesting stories attached to them. And, so people weren't necessarily buying the item, they were buying a story with, they were either buying an item with an interesting story attached to it or an interesting story with an item attached to it. But either way, the story is what made them special.
And in every instance, I've mentioned that, Paul, leaders I talk to, family members, everyone immediately gets it. No one questions why people would pay more for the same item when it has a story associated with it. That's why I think it is a powerful example showing the value of stories. We make sense of the world around us. We value things more when there is a powerful story attached to it. So that's why I think that's a great example to visualize that if we are not telling stories to make our points, then we are valuing that item at the $1.25 rather than being worth a heck of a lot more.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you asked me about that. I love that example as well.
So part of Paul, what you also mentioned in your 10 stories great leaders tell is that in addition to understanding the importance of story, how to tell great stories, and the power of storytelling, there are certain stories that leaders need to be able to tell. As you mentioned in your Lead with Storybook, you had more, you had 17 of them, but you narrowed it down to the 10 stories that are important for leaders to be able to tell. First question, what how did you narrow to these 10? Why did you narrow to these 10 before we talk about what those 10 stories are?
Yeah. So my kind of starting list was more like 70, by the way. So I think there are 21 different leadership challenges, leadership type stories in Lead with a Story. And then I wrote a Parenting with a Story book, and there's another 25. And my third book was Sell with a Story. So there's 25 sales and marketing type stories. So if you add those up, it's somewhere around 70. And at some point I just got challenged, like, Paul, that's a lot of stories. I mean, I'm new at this. Come on, where do I start? And so that was a fair challenge to me. And so I sat down to think about, well, if I had to pick 10, let's pick 10. What are the most important 10 for a leader to share? And my criteria for finding those was, first of all, they're stories that my clients most frequently ask me for help on. So after 10 years of working with senior executives in storytelling, the 10 I wanted to come up with would have to be ones that I knew executives wanted to be able to tell. So that tells me that these are practical or in-demand stories, right? Secondly, I wanted stories that would last a long time, meaning they would be stories you could tell over and over and over again and get value out of it. So they wouldn't be things that would need to change frequently. So for example, the vision story is one of them, your company's vision story. Your vision shouldn't change more than every 5 or 6 years, right? I mean, it shouldn't stay the same always, but it shouldn't change every few months. So if you come up with a good vision story, you can tell it over and over and over again for a while. Same for your strategy story. Strategy shouldn't change every month, right? But you may be going through some particular change that requires something, and that story may be useless in a few days. So anyway, and then well, I guess lastly, I wanted stories that I knew were in areas where leaders needed to exert some influence in an organization. So there could be stories that met those other two criteria, but they just weren't important areas for senior leaders to engage on. Somebody else can take care of that. So those criteria kind of got me to the 10 that I'm sure you're going to ask me next to share with everyone.
Yeah, and I love the 10, and that's why I recommend to all the listeners also to get the 10 stories great leaders tell and think through each and every one of them, because I do think they're really powerful. And I'm glad you narrowed it down to 10, Paul, in that for you, you live storytelling. And for us, we might be fascinated with storytelling and want to understand nuance. For most leaders, they want to use storytelling as a vehicle for effective communication. So narrowing it down to 10, again, makes your already accessible concepts more accessible and easier for them to actually implement in their daily interactions, which is a key part of the value that you bring. It's not the knowledge from the book that someone reads and says, aha, now I understand, if they can't then do something differently as a result of it. That's why I really appreciated the way you went through the stories in 10 great stories leaders tell. So, what are those 10 stories?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, let me just, I appreciate that you recognize that the goal of that book was to be very accessible. In fact, it was designed to be read in about an hour. So I could probably test your reading skill if I could ask you how long it took you to read the book. So if you got it
By the
read in
way,
less than an hour, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, it is both a quick read, and I believe in it so much that I will be sending it to every one of my guests that I interview on their own life journey on
Mm,
Tuesdays, leadership guests, because I think the other thing I believe, Paul, is that the leaders, as much as they need to read and learn at a faster pace than they have ever before, they're also overwhelmed. So in most instances, people have more books than they should read that they don't
yeah,
ever get to. This is accessible so they can flip through it, easily read it, and understand the concepts and then apply it. So that's
yeah.
why I really appreciate it.
Very good. Good. Well, that was the idea. Okay. So the 10. So the first four go together because they're about setting the direction for the organization. So that's where we came from. So that's our founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, because a strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So imagine you're a leader and you can tell those four stories, you're much more likely to get the organization to go where you want them to go, because you can easily and in a human, compelling, visceral manner explain to them where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. All right, the next four go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. So that's a corporate values story, corporate values and ethics story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about the customer, so that everybody at the organization can have a more human understanding of the ultimate boss that you're all working for. What we do for our customers, which is kind of a classical sales story. So a story about what your company does that's so awesome, people should pay you money to do it, right? And then number 8 is how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story because it's often the marketing department's job to differentiate you from your competitors, right? So again, if you can tell those 4 stories, you're much more likely to be able to explain, who your company is, what you believe, who you serve, what you do for those customers, and how you're different from your competitors. And by the way, just because I call those last 2 a sales story and a marketing story doesn't mean that only the sales VP or the marketing director should tell those stories at all. All of these stories are stories that I think every leader at a company should be able to tell. Now, if you work in the marketing department, you ought to be able to tell lots of marketing stories. If you work in the sales department, you ought to be able to tell lots of sales stories. But if you work in any other department, you ought to be able to tell one good sales story. and one good marketing story and one of all the rest of these two, which, by the way, was one of my other criteria that I forgot of how I picked them, is I wanted them to be stories that every leader, no matter what functional discipline they come from, that they'd be relevant for them. All right. But if you're keeping track, there's two left. All right. Number 9, 10. And these are more personal to you, the leader. So 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. Now, not you, but you, whoever you're talking to, right? So that's obviously a recruiting story. And those two stories are important because every leader's job is finding talented people and bringing them into the organization and having them stay and follow your leadership. Again, that's not just the job of HR or the recruiting department. Every leader needs to be able to tell at least one of those type of stories as well. And that, I think, is a pretty good starting place for a leader to start to develop some storytelling skills.
It is. And every one of those 10 are essential stories that leaders at all levels of the organization should be able to tell. I would love to touch on a couple of them, Paul, based on the leaders I interact with, some of the senior leadership teams that I coach and guide. Many are pretty good at the where we came from story. They understand and have been telling that over and over again, sometimes helped by their PR departments and others, but still those stories are really good. One of the areas that I find they have difficulty with is why we can't stay there, in that in many instances, they're celebrating so much the where we have come from and the heritage of success that we've had. The why we can't stay there is where they face some difficulty. And with respect to that, I want to very briefly say I also had a conversation with John Cotter. He talks about the mistake leaders make in change, in talking about the burning platform, where we can't stay here, things are horrible, therefore, it's going to fall apart if we don't change. That paralyzes people. So they can't be doing that. It needs to be a positive case. But I find leaders have a harder time effectively celebrating where they're at, the success they've had, even post-pandemic, pivoting to virtual and everything else, but why we can't stay here. So what are some of your thoughts with respect to how leaders can better tell the why we can't stay here stories?
Yeah, so I agree. It's often difficult for them to tell. Most leaders' reasons and justification for doing anything, often comes down to some financial metrics. Well, this is going to increase our sales, or it's going to increase our profit margins, or it's going to increase the stock price, or it's going to be a high net present value project, or high ROI, or whatever. And you need those in business, and those are great decision-making criteria and planning criteria. But when it comes time to inform and motivate the organization, those things are often not very effective. And some of that's because oftentimes the employees whom you have to motivate and have to internalize the reason for the changes are not, the shareholders of the company. They're not the ones who are going to benefit from higher sales and higher profits and better ROI and higher stock price and all that kind of stuff. So it's not very motivating to them. And even for people who do have a financial stake in the company, it's not the most motivating thing to say, oh, I really can't wait to get up and go to work tomorrow so that I can improve our quarterly profits by 3% this quarter. That's not the kind of thing that gets most people out of bed in the morning. The kind of thing that gets most people out of bed in the morning is being able to make a difference in somebody's life, whether it's theirs or other people's. And so that's why I think the example that I used in the book was, for a pharmaceutical company, it might be the story of, one person whose life you saved, or whose life you might save if you finish working on this project, and invent this new drug or whatever. Now, most of us don't work at places where we make life-saving products, so that's a little bit unfair, and I understand that. But everybody works at a company who does something that helps people, right? There's no company in the world that doesn't do something that helps somebody do something. And so to find these case for change stories, what you're looking for is one of those human beings, whether it's one of your customers or your employees or somebody else's customers or somebody else's employees or your family or somebody somewhere, is benefiting personally from the use of your product and would benefit from the change that you're trying to make in your organization, because it'll make your product or service better or more affordable or make the world a better place or something. Find out who that person is and tell a story about them. Tell a story about their life before you make this change, and then how their life is going to be after you make this change. And like I said, it could be the employees of the company. The change we're going through is really just to make your jobs easier. So I'm going to tell a story about Sally in accounts payable, who, works, 60 hours a week to get her job done. And we're going to put in this new accounts payable software so she can go home at the end of the day at 5 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock at night. So she can see her kids and, spend time with her husband and, and have a weekend to herself instead of having to work all weekend. And now it's going to take a lot of work to put in this new software. It's going to be 2 or 3 months of a lot of work, but the payoff is for you and people like Sally, and tell her story. So those case for change stories are stories about the people who will benefit from making the change that you're recommending, not about financials, no numbers, no dollar signs. You already have that, and you're probably already using that. This is the people side of the equation.
And I wonder, Paul, how this relates to the purpose of the organization, and can the numbers reached be a part of this? So I'm trying to understand this process. So someone working in a financial institution that is trying to provide funding to people in the community, they would give an example of an individual who has benefited from this funding and started their business and so on and so forth. Would we can do a lot more of this, be part of this why we can't stay there story? That's the reason for our growth. Or how can you make the case of we can't stay here? Uh,
Yeah, you could do it that way. I think a more effective way would be to tell a story of somebody who did not get that funding or whatever that they were providing. So this is where it would be a failure story. Let me tell you about somebody who, quit their company. They had a passion to start this new business, or they've, dropped out of school just to go start this company, and they got, 6 months into it and ran out of cash. They had a fabulous idea and a wonderful product, and everybody was pulling for them, and they went bankrupt in the first 6 months. And so they went back to school and went back to their old crummy old job with their crummy old boss in their crummy old office, and they never started a business ever again. We could have changed that. We could have helped that woman, today be a successful CEO entrepreneur, but we didn't. And we didn't because of these 5 reasons. And I want to change all 5 of those reasons so that she or people like her can be successful. So failure stories are probably more effective in the case for change than success stories.
Oh, I love that, Paul, because it's also focused on the users, on the community, on others, rather than being self-focused. So it's not, we can't stay there because we want to grow.
Yes. Right.
It's, we can't stay there because of the impact on the community and the lack of impact if we stay there.
Right. Yeah. Being other focused on other people is almost always more motivating than being me focused. In fact, there's a number of studies that show this, and I think I put this in one of my recent books, but somebody done a study where it was a telemarketing company, and they tried some tests where they brought before their telemarketing shift, they brought everybody into a room 10 minutes before, and one group, they asked them to write down, no, I'm sorry. They read them stories about how the job that they have in telemarketing is going to help them be more successful in the future when they get different jobs and they get out of college someday and they, go become a boss somewhere. They're going to be much better at it. Well, that was one group. The second group, they read them stories about people who benefited from the thing that they were telemarketing. I think they were raising money for some charity or whatever. So they read them stories about the people who were on the receiving end of the benefits of these charitable donations and what a difference it made in their lives. So, and then the third group was a control group that they brought them in there just to, have a cup of coffee for 10 minutes and then go start your work. They didn't do anything to them, other than the coffee. And so this first group was telling them stories about how you, the employee, are going to benefit so much from the work you're about to go do. And the other one was other people are going to benefit from the work that you are about to go do. And it should be no surprise to you that the control group that just drank the coffee, their sales didn't change because they didn't do anything different. The first group, their sales actually went up. Okay. The group that was told how much you are going to benefit personally, not just the money we pay you, but you're going to benefit from having this kind of experience. So their sales went up. The third group, though, that got told stories about other people doubled from that number, even stronger sales growth. So that turns out to be more motivating to people, to most people, learning how their work is benefiting others, not just themselves.
That's a powerful example of how the why we can't stay there can work, most especially when focused on the other people. Now, another one of the stories I wanted to touch on, Paul, where I see a lot of leaders having difficulty with is the why I lead the way I do, in that it requires a certain level of authenticity. It requires going beyond the standard press releases and standard PR coaching that some of the leaders have gotten. So, how would you guide leaders to effectively tell their own story, why I lead the way I do?
Yeah, I think here I've just got to give you an example, because that's the best way to learn this. And I like the example in the book, so I'll share that one. Unless you want to, you're familiar enough with that one? Do you want to give that one a shot, or do you want me to do it?
I would prefer if you do. It's your story.
Okay. Yeah. So this one came from a guy named Mike Figliolo. And his first leadership experience, he went to West Point. So he's a military guy, U.S. Army, or was at that age. So his first real leadership opportunity was in the military, and it was in a training exercise where he was going to be commanding a platoon of a tank with several other Army soldiers in the tank. And the exercise was friendly fire kind of thing where they were going to have that's not the right word. He would be so mad of me for saying that. That wasn't. Anyway, it was just a training exercise. It was out in California. They're on a 10-mile long, 5-mile wide training field. 400 tanks lined up on this side of the field and 400 tanks lined up on that side. And they're going to go into battle together. But of course, they're not going to shoot live ordnances at each other. Their gun turrets have been outfitted with laser pointers with some receivers on the tank so that they know when they got, virtually shot. So anyway, he happens to be assigned to be the leader of the first tank that's going to go into battle on his side of the field with 399 other tanks behind him. So of course, the night before the exercise, he sits down with the commanding officer and they look at a map of the terrain and figure out where the high ground is so he can have the best odds of winning the exercise. Well, the next morning, the exercise starts and he's in his tank and racing out onto the field at 40 miles an hour, however fast those tanks go. And he gets to the first place where he's got to make a decision to turn left or turn right. And he just doesn't know what to do. I guess a battlefield looks different when you're looking at it through the crack in that hatch of a tank bouncing up and down at 40 miles an hour than it does on a map in a conference room. So he's got a decision to make. He can either stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, and figure out the right thing to do, which might take, 30 seconds. Or option two is he could just guess. Well, Mike chose option two. He yells out, "Driver, turn left," even though he has no idea if that's the right thing to do. So the driver turns left. A few seconds later, the light inside of his tank starts flashing, which means you just got shot by a laser. You're dead. So they got to stop the tank and pop the hatch. Those guys are done for the day. Well, a few seconds later, tank number two turns left right behind him because that's their job. Follow the leader, right? Well, then their light starts flashing. They're done. Well, tank number three turns left and their light starts flashing. Well, but the guys in tank number four saw 3 tanks turn left and get virtually shot and killed. So they realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right. And then 396 other tanks turned right. They took the high ground and won the exercise. Now, Mike made a mistake that day. Right? He turned left when he should have turned right. Leadership mistake. But he learned a valuable leadership lesson from that. And that is this: sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than make the right decision slowly. Because just imagine what would have happened if he had chosen option one. He stopped the tank, turned the light on, got the map out. There'd have been 400 tanks lined up getting picked off one at a time, right? But because he turned left and things went wrong, people realized it and they could monitor and adjust. And the same thing happens in business all the time, right? We get so paralyzed with, analysis paralysis. We'll be analyzing a situation for months before we decide what to do. And that whole time, our competition is still moving forward. So sometimes it's better to just make a decision, make an informed decision, an educated guess. And if you're wrong, you'll find out, right? Life, like war, like business, has a way of letting you know that you made a bad decision and you can change it. So that is an example of a leadership philosophy story, because it explains why Mike is a decisive leader today. It explains why he has become the leader, and why that is one of his leadership philosophies, is that it's better sometimes to make the wrong decision quickly than the right decision slowly. And now he could explain that to you by just saying, look, I'm a decisive leader, and I got that way because I believe that sometimes making the wrong decision quickly is better than making the right decision slowly. And that sounds like a nice little bumper sticker, but like, what does that mean? And why should I believe that? And what does that even mean? And like, what's an example when that, like, it raises more questions than it does answers. But by telling you the story, which is his leadership philosophy story, not his leadership philosophy, it's easy for anybody to understand. And by the way, that's just one. Like, every leader probably has multiple principles that they follow in leadership, and they probably learned all of them from something that happened. And so you might need 4, 5, or 6 of these leadership philosophy stories to really fully kind of articulate why you became the leader you became, and what your leadership philosophy is. But guaranteed, for your audience listening, things like that have happened to them that have shaped who they are as a leader and how they lead. And those are the stories you need to get back in touch with so that you can tell them to other people.
And in thinking about those leadership philosophy stories, Paul, is it best to focus on leadership philosophies that the story is an example of a setback or a failure, or an example of success? How do you guide leaders on, as they're reflecting on leadership philosophies? Because I imagine you can come up with different kinds of stories that communicate the same leadership philosophy. Is it dependent on the leader's style, or do you have guidance with respect to the type of stories leaders should seek in being able to tell their leadership philosophy story?
Yeah, I think you need a mix of them. I think these kind of leadership philosophy stories, like case for change stories, often work better as failure stories than as success stories. But you definitely need a mix. What you don't want to have for sure is all of them be success stories, because again, that just sounds like you're bragging, right? And most people don't want to work for a braggadocious, self-absorbed leader. And if all you do is walk around telling success stories, that really is going to be how you come across. The other reason why failure stories work particularly well for leaders in general, is that it's humanizing and shows some vulnerability. And most importantly, it shows your organization that you're more interested in nurturing their growth and development than you are about protecting your own ego, because you're willing to share your failures specifically so that the people who work for you don't have to make the same mistakes you made. Insecure, ingracious leaders hide their failure stories. They don't want anybody to know that they've ever made a mistake. They want people to think that they're perfect. And that's the kind of leader nobody wants to work for. They'd rather work for the leader that will say, oh, of course, I'm human. I make mistakes all the time. Let me tell you the 3 biggest mistakes I ever made. One of them got me fired. Okay. Like, everybody wants to hear those stories, right? Because they want to avoid making those 3 big mistakes and avoid getting fired. So please, leaders, please tell your failure stories. Your people will appreciate it.
Yeah, and part of this is, Paul, once you go through this and read the 10 great stories, 10 stories great leaders tell, once you go through it and think about a couple of stories for each one of the elements that you mentioned, then you have your stories. It's not as if every single day you wake up and you have to come up with new stories to tell. There are instances where you can use new stories and come up with new stories. But in most instances, whether it's where we came from, why we are or how we are different from our competitors, why I lead the way I do, these are stories that leaders can incorporate after they have a good sense of what that story is, can incorporate in their communication repeatedly, whether communicating internally, representing that future for the organization and their team members, or communicating externally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these stories are good both inside and outside the company. It's kind of obvious, I think, when you look through them, which is which. Like your strategy story, that's typically an inside thing, right? You typically don't go out telling your strategy to the world, right? Um, but you will tell, a recruiting story. Obviously, is almost always an external story, not an internal story. So there's a mix of both of those in this list.
So, as leaders are telling their stories, Paul, how can they make their stories more memorable and more impactful?
Yeah. So, first of all, being more memorable will make it more impactful, because if people don't remember your story, obviously it's not going to have any future impact on them. So one of those things is a big avenue to get the other one. And the main thing that makes stories more memorable, believe it or not, is a surprise. Okay. Surprises in a story, often a surprise ending in a story. So, like, you love a surprise ending in the movies you watch and in the books you're reading, right? Um, but a surprise plays an even more important role in leadership stories, and that is that it makes it more memorable for a very physiological reason. And that is that when humans are surprised, it triggers a release of adrenaline in their system. And adrenaline is shown to make what psychologists call the memory consolidation process faster and more efficient. So literally, when somebody is surprised, everything that happens for the next 30 seconds, minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, as long as that adrenaline is still kind of coursing through their body, their memory is heightened. They're going to remember what happens during those few moments better than when they did not have a rush of adrenaline. Okay. So having a surprise in your story triggers that adrenaline release, which makes everything else that's about to happen in your story, up to and including the end of the story and the lesson and the recommended action that you want them to take. So it serves a very practical purpose to put a surprise in your story, because it'll make it more memorable, and that will make it more impactful.
So, Paul, I sort of related to that when you had mentioned it, but an example that you shared made it more relevant for me, because in many instances I would be struggling with, okay, how can I come up with a surprise with this story? And you coach and guide leaders with pretty simple rearrangement of the way they tell the story. Every story can have an element of surprise. It's not as if this needs to be something that uh, is drastically different than your regular storytelling. You can change the structure of the story to have an element of surprise in it.
Right. In fact, all of these techniques to improve story, they're techniques, and you can apply them to almost any story. You don't have to pick, oh, I need to pick a story that's got a surprise in it. Well, no, just make any story, but then make it surprising. But just by using these techniques. So I think the one you're talking about is the tea kettle example. Is that it? Yeah. So so just by way of example, so imagine and there was at one point a 9-year-old boy named James. So 9-year-old James is in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. While mom and auntie are sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil, and he's just fascinated with it. right? He's watching the jet of steam come out of the kettle, and he's got a spoon. He holds it up there into the jet of steam and watches as little drops of water condense on the spoon. They trickle down into a cup that he's got sitting there so it doesn't make a mess in his mom's kitchen. And he's just watching that cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother gets tired of him just hanging out in the kitchen, and she kind of barks at him. She's like, James, like, go do your homework, read a book, ride your bike. Aren't you ashamed of yourself just staring at the tea kettle boiling for an hour now? Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, of course, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on that fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. Now, I know you read that story, so you knew it already, but most of your audience that are listening to us today, unless they happen to be a history buff, were probably surprised at the end of that story that it turned out to be, oh, that was James Watt, the guy who invented the steam engine. Oh, yeah. Now, but ask yourself why. Why was that a surprise? And the reason it was a surprise, because that story, I didn't just make up that story. That I read that story in a book titled James Watt. It was written in 1905 by Andrew Carnegie. It was a biography of the inventor of the steam engine. So, of course, it was no surprise to me at all that the story in chapter 1 about 9-year-old James was about the guy who was going to grow up to invent the steam engine, because the whole book was about James Watt. But again, to your audience, unless they're a history buff, they probably were surprised because I didn't tell you his last name. And I didn't tell you the year either. So 2 of the things that I coach my audience in that structure, those 8 questions you have to answer in a story, 2 of the early questions are, when did it happen? So where and when did it happen? And who was the main character? Okay. And I answered them, but only partly. I told you where it happened, Mom's kitchen, but I didn't tell you when it happened. And I told you his name, told you his first name, but I didn't tell you his last name. So that's the technique. You withhold a part of the information that you're supposed to give the audience, that they're expecting to get at the beginning of the story, and don't give it to them to the end, until the end. And it creates a surprise ending just magically. And you really can do it with almost any story.
And it makes it really powerful. I love that story because, as you say, Paul, it shows that by slightly rearranging some of the information, you make what can seem like a normal sounding story. If you had started out by saying James Watt, founder of the steam engine, was in his mother's kitchen, that wouldn't have had the same excitement, same surprise ending, wouldn't have been as memorable. So when leaders think about the stories they tell, it's the same story. At times, it's just leaving out a couple of elements until the very end that makes it a surprise. So they don't need to be script writers, movie writers. With the 10 stories that you share in your book, all leaders can, with some reflection and a little thought put into it, become great storytellers of memorable stories that can impact their teams and people in the community as they communicate the message of their organization, bring team members, and get much more engagement.
That's the goal for sure.
So I wonder, Paul, in addition to your own book, are there any leadership resources you typically find yourself recommending to leaders as they want to understand the process of storytelling and how to do it more effectively?
Well, there are a lot of books out there. Like I said, I've read almost all of them. That's not true, because people write more every year. So at one point I'd read almost all of them. And that's a great place to start. If you're somebody who likes to learn by reading, buy some books on the topic. And I've just written some of them. There are lots of others, right? And there are some very good ones. But people learn a lot of different ways these days, and thank goodness that we have a lot of options. So watch a YouTube video. Take a online training course, go to an in-person training course, hire a coach. The analogy I use is, if you woke up one day and decided you wanted to learn how to play the guitar, what would you do? Would you just go buy a guitar and put it under your bed and hope that by osmosis you'd wake up one morning knowing how to play the guitar? Well, of course not. You'd go take guitar lessons from somebody who knew how to play the guitar. Well, it's the same with storytelling. It's an art, not a science, but you can learn it. Just like you may not be musically inclined, like I'm not musically inclined, but I'll bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, I probably could. I mean, I might not ever be great at it, but I could probably get good at it by following a proven method for learning it and getting somebody who knew how. So it's the same with storytelling. If you treat it like any other business skill that you want to acquire, then you will acquire it, which means reading some books, taking some classes, emulating somebody who does it well, all three of the above. So that's the main advice. I guess treat it like a real serious leadership skill, and invest some time and resources into learning it.
And that's why, again, I think your books are really important in this, Paul, most especially the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, in that you gave the example of music. I can watch someone that is a master piano player or guitar player and admire their skill. However, I have a tough time breaking that down and understanding how can I play those notes. So there's a long distance between my music playing skills and seeing someone who is a master at it. So while it's important to watch great speakers do their thing and tell those great stories, I think we need a structure. And what you've done in your books is provide a structure so leaders can find a way to tell these stories effectively, because their role is not storytelling. They need to be able to use storytelling in their roles. So how can the audience find out more about what you do, Paul, connect with you, and also find out more about your books?
Yeah, thanks. Probably the best place to do all of those things is on my website. So the links to the books and the training courses and things are there. So that's leadwithastory.com. So it's just the name of my first book. I never got more creative after that with website naming, so it just stuck. So Lead with a Story.
I really appreciate the conversation, Paul, most especially the fact that, as I mentioned, you've gone beyond just talking about why storytelling is important and how to do it well. You've broken it down to make it accessible. And I think that's really important. In your book, you also say stories move us, they engage us, they inspire us. Stories give us examples of how to act and how not to act. The best ones stay with us forever. Thank you so much, Paul Smith, for helping leaders that listen to this podcast be able to tell stories that will stay with their team members, organizations, and the community forever. Thank you so much for joining the conversation, Paul Smith.
Yeah, you're very welcome. This was fun. Thanks for having me.